Is the coronavirus out of control in Brazil? Hundreds of thousands have lost their lives to COVID-19, but who's to blame for the devastating death toll? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Brazil's coronavirus crisis. Now, from the very beginning, President Jair Bolsonaro has downplayed the coronavirus. In fact, he once called the deadly disease a little flu. But a year later, more than 300,000 Brazilians have lost their lives to COVID-19, and many believe the president is to blame. Despite having the second highest death toll in the world, Bolsonaro has refused to order a nationwide lockdown, claiming the economic impact would be more devastating than the virus itself. But not all Brazilians agree with that theory, and anger around the president's handling of the pandemic is growing. Add the health crisis to an economy struggling to recover and massive political tension, and Brazil could be sailing into the perfect storm. Here's Natalie Pahonen.
Nós temos que enfrentar os nossos problemas. Chega de frescura, de mimimi. Vamos ficar chorando até quando?
Stop whining. That was the message from Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro last month as his country was fast becoming an epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic. For many of his citizens stricken with COVID-19, finding energy just to breathe is hard enough. The healthcare system has been pushed to the brink, overwhelmed with tens of thousands of new infections each day, forcing some medical staff to do the unthinkable. With reports that in some hospitals sedatives have run out, so critical patients have had to be physically tied down so they can be intubated.
The patient is subjected to a form of torture and cannot even ask for help when he or she feels uncomfortable in the situation they are in. That is why the lack of these drugs has made us suffer a lot with our profession, and question every day when it will end and when we will have some consolation.
Brazil is now only second to the United States with the number of pandemic deaths. The daily death toll is the world's highest, and March was the deadliest month so far. 66,573 people died. More than half of the patients in intensive care in that month were under 40 years old.
Please take care. You don't want to lose someone. It's very painful. We saw a family being destroyed not a long time ago. A father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, all in the same family. So it's very sad.
So many people are dying that in Sao Paulo, grave diggers bury the deceased at night. Funerals are held in darkness. In Brazil, even the cemeteries are overwhelmed by the pandemic. Medical groups have been demanding a national lockdown as the country struggles with a new variant of the virus. The president has repeatedly rejected that advice. He says the economic damage would do more harm than the virus.
Não vai ter lockdown nacional. Como alguns ousam dizer por aí que as Forças Armadas deveriam ajudar alguns governadores nas suas medidas restritivas. O nosso exército brasileiro não vai à rua para manter o povo dentro de casa.
The Supreme Court has ordered a congressional inquiry into the government's response to the health crisis. It'll investigate whether the president has been negligent in handling the pandemic. Bolsonaro is one of the few world leaders who has played down the severity of the virus, calling it a little flu. He's proudly flaunted social distancing measures and gone as far as to say a COVID vaccine would turn people into crocodiles. Yet he bristles at criticism of the way he's handled the crisis.
Eu acho que eu sou o único líder mundial que apanha isoladamente. O mais fácil é ficar do lado da massa, da grande maioria. Se evita problemas, não é acusado de genocida, não sofre ataques por parte de gente que pensa diferente de mim.
Bolsonaro continues to face fires from multiple fronts. The vaccination rollout has been slow, unemployment and poverty keep rising, and then there's the implosion of his own cabinet. In March, he sacked the defense minister, and the country is up to health minister number 4 since the pandemic started. Bolsonaro has been a polarizing figure from the far right since he entered politics. His anti-establishment approach helped secure his first term in office. He'll be relying on a core base of supporters when he seeks re-election next year. One of his most vocal critics is also eligible to run against him, the left-wing former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. But before that election can be contested, Brazil needs to chart a path out of the pandemic, and that prospect appears more difficult by the day. Natalie Perhanen, The Newsmakers.
Okay, let's get straight to our panel now. And from the Brazilian capital, Brasilia, I'm joined by Marcio Coimbra. He is the president of the Economic Freedom Foundation. In Boston, Massachusetts, is Julio Morais, CEO of the Public Administration Institution. That's a consulting firm for governments and entrepreneurs. And in New York, we have Brian Meir, a journalist and sociologist and editor of Brazil Wire. Thanks all so much for being with us. Brian, I ended with your introduction. Let me start with you then. We hear, COVID numbers all the time, but some will argue they are misleading, not least because they are not being given per capita. Brazil, for example, we say it's the country with the second highest death toll in the world, but per capita, it's actually not even in the top 10. It's actually behind Italy and the United Kingdom, and basically tied with its own neighbor, Peru. So, is it fair to say that Bolsonaro's management has been so disastrous?
Yes, it is, because these numbers are growing really fast. Whereas the UK and Belgium, for example, and Italy, which are all countries that have higher per capita death tolls, are implementing vaccines in an efficient and rapid manner. The Brazilian president has been sabotaging the vaccine program and telling his followers not to take the vaccine. An envoy from the Trump administration came down and talked Bolsonaro out of purchasing Sputnik vaccine last year, and he was slow to approve the CoronaVac vaccine for geopolitical ideology reasons because it was Chinese. And so these numbers are expected to grow really fast this month, unfortunately. But it's also, as you said, it's important to point out that Brazil is not that unique. One of the main problems we have in Brazil, which is a country I've lived in for 25 years, I'm just up in New York temporarily right now, is that Bolsonaro just copied Donald Trump. So a lot of the stuff he's been saying, spreading misinformation about chloroquine, for example, being a magic cure for coronavirus, and that you should be careful about vaccines and not wear masks and things like that, is just him copying his idol, Donald Trump. So I feel like he's been turned into this international boogeyman, but the real problems in Brazil are structural. The public health department has been gutted since the 2016 right-wing coup against Dilma Rousseff. In 2010, under Lula, they administered 80 million flu vaccines in 3 months. And the vaccine program is moving at a snail's pace right now because it's being sabotaged. It's been sabotaged by the federal government. Right.
Let me ask more about that, the past vaccine campaigns that, even globally were very impressive. But first, Brian, tell me, as you said, you're usually based in Brazil. What personally have you seen there? How badly are people struggling? How sick are they?
Well, my wife has lost 5 family members, to give you an idea of how bad it is, in Uberaba. And I live on the north side of Sao Paulo, which is one of the worst places hit. And, it's just depressing to look out my window every day and see people standing out on the square below my house, drinking with no masks on, and just walking around with no masks on as if it's nothing. As if it's just like what Bolsonaro said, a little cold that they don't have to worry about. So you can't underestimate the negative effects that he and his administration have caused on the Brazilian people. This is the worst sanitary crisis in Brazilian history. It's over 360,000 dead already.
Right. Julio, I asked Brian about the numbers, and now I'll ask you, since you feel that Bolsonaro is often very unfairly blamed for just about everything. So has he done the best he could do with COVID-19?
Well, he has not. I don't agree with the way he's handling the whole situation. But the problem right now, the biggest problem in Brazil right now, is the political battlefield that's going on right now. We have 11 states out of 26 under investigation for corruption. São Paulo, Rio, Amapá, Ceará. They all bought like very expensive ventilation compared to other states. Federal funds being those states have been getting federal funds, but it's not been using. We have Rio de Janeiro that got fund for 7 temporary hospital, only one is working. And everyone blamed Bolsonaro for the disaster, which at one point I agree, but I think all the governors should get the blame too. I don't think it's fair for Bolsonaro being blamed for the bad news, but also when there's a credit, the governors got it and not Bolsonaro. So I don't think it's been fair the way people point fingers at the president right now.
Okay, Marcio, should there be more blame shared, do you think, for the poor response to COVID in Brazil?
Not really. I think that most of the blame resides on the president, resides on Bolsonaro, because he had the opportunity to buy vaccines last year from Pfizer, for example, 70 million doses, and he preferred not to do it. He said that there was competition between the labs, and so Brazil could get a better deal, so less expensive vaccines. So he denied he said that there was a denial about the pandemic in Brazil. He was the forefront of this denial. And he said that people should not worry about the virus. And he didn't help to produce a vaccine in Brazil. The governor of São Paulo, João Doria, made a deal with a Chinese lab, and they produced the vaccine that now is responsible for 90% of Brazilian immunization. Now, if we were just going to wait for Bolsonaro to buy a vaccine from abroad, we would have been just vaccinating 10% of our people. So thank God we have João Doria as the governor of São Paulo, and that was able to develop a vaccine with a Chinese lab and put this available to Brazilians right now. So I think the blame is mostly to Mr. Bolsonaro, because in our tax system, most of the money goes for the federal government. So it resides on the federal government to buy the vaccines and send the vaccines to the states. That's what has been going on right now. The federal government bought the vaccine made in São Paulo, and it's making it available for the whole country. But there is no vaccines enough. So Brazil didn't buy vaccines until now from Pfizer or from Moderna and other labs.
Okay, Julio, it's really interesting, I have to say, to hear from you, because you had been one of the staunchest Bolsonaro supporters really up until this weak response to COVID. But as you know, Bolsonaro has justified all his actions because he's mostly said, I mean, vaccines aside, his biggest argument was that he would not institute national lockdowns because the damage to the economy would be greater, worse than the virus itself. Could Brazil's economy, do you think, have withstood the impact of a nationwide lockdown and stricter COVID measures? In your opinion, was Bolsonaro at least right about that?
No, yeah, he's right on lockdown. I don't think it's fair to tell anyone to be home because everyone has a different need. Right now, we have the BBC News 2 days ago published the hunger in Brazil, especially Islam, growing. And there's not that Brazil can do right now because the Brazil doesn't have the financial resource the U.S. has. According to the BBC News 2 days ago, they said that the 600 reais that Bolsonaro gave to the population, Brazilian population, was the biggest single injection of financial aid in Brazil history. But like he said right now, he doesn't have money to continue that. So right now, tell people to stay home, which I'm in favor of the lockdown. I think the lockdown is necessary, but it's not all size fits everyone. Right now, telling people to stay home, people will get hungry. They won't have the means to feed the family or take care of the family. So that's why I think the lockdown should be up to each person and not it should not be obligated. I think Bolsonaro should encourage the lockdown, but not enforce the lockdown.
Okay, Brian, would that have worked?
No, there's a myth that Brazil doesn't have any money. When Dilma Rousseff was illegally thrown out of office in 2016, Brazil had built its foreign reserves up from $49 billion to $320 billion. It had $240 billion in loans to the U.S. that the U.S. is paying back with interest. It had lent money to the IMF, $20 billion with interest, and it had around $200 billion in foreign reserves. All of this accumulated so that Brazil would have the capacity to react in an emergency economic or social situation. And it's also important to note that the 600 reais that was given out temporarily last year by Bolsonaro has been reduced to 150 reais now for people. That's about $30 US. And so Brazil has the money. It's an upper middle income country. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world to guarantee. And also remembering that this yo-yo effect of these semi-lockdowns and returns to opening up, which has happened in states like Sao Paulo with Doria, has just exacerbated the economic crisis. If Brazil had followed China, Vietnam, New Zealand's lead and implemented an efficient lockdown for 2 months, paying people the money they needed to stay at home, it wouldn't be the worst country in the world for COVID-19 right now.
Okay, Julio, I'll let you respond quickly, and then I'd like to get back to Marcio. Go ahead.
Yes, let's remember that the federal government cannot just allocate a money from one part and bring to the other part without the Congress approve. That's one of the reasons we removed Dilma from office, because she was playing around with the numbers, but we need the Congress to approve that. And right now, there's a battlefield in the Congress, federal government, and the state government.
Okay. Brian, I know you don't agree with Julio's analysis. Quick response, and I'd like to move on.
Yeah, Bolsonaro's doing the same fiscal peddling move in the same governmental ministry that's legal now that Dilma was removed for office from. So that's not a legitimate argument. And the president and the federal government do have powers. Let's remember that the Bolsonaro's allies are in charge of the Congress and Senate right now. So it's a false argument to say that he didn't have the ability to do this.
Okay. Let's look forward then further, away from the pandemic and toward the next election, actually. It's over a year away, but still. Marcio, let me ask you this. You know, Bolsonaro never portrayed himself as a particularly empathetic character, and that didn't matter to a lot of voters. In fact, that was appreciated by a number of Brazilians. They wanted something more hardline. They appreciated his Trump-esque stance on a lot of issues. But now we have had the pandemic, and we've seen hundreds of thousands of Brazilians lose their lives. Do you think this actually will be the determining factor for the upcoming election, and it's really the perfect moment now for his opponents to capitalize on?
Yeah, indeed. I think you were right, because this government is facing a lot of problems considering the pandemic and considering the economy. On my point of view, and I run an economic institute, the economy in Brazil didn't went back on track because we didn't prepare ourselves with vaccines. We are seeing what is happening in Israel and in the United States. The countries are going back. They are reopening their business. They are reopening business in the UK, but they did do social distance before and lockdowns before with heavy vaccinating efforts. So I think that what is happening now in Brazil is that we are facing a perfect storm for Bolsonaro. We're facing problems with the economy and with the pandemic. But he said to put the economy before the pandemic. No, it needed to be put after the pandemic, because now denying the pandemic and didn't getting people vaccinated, it means that our economy will take longer to get back. And this longer will reach 2022 when it's the election. And then he will begin his election year with more than 500,000 deaths on him, and also a really weak economy. So I think it creates a perfect storm for him over next year, and there is the time for his opponents to start working. Okay. And I think he's going to be very weak on the election year.
Julio, do you think Bolsonaro can weather this approaching perfect storm?
Honestly, that's a good question, because right now, like I said, the political battlefield right now, the corona is being a flag that every governor, especially João Dória from São Paulo, is pretending to run for 2022 election. So that's what they've been using to bring Bolsonaro image down. This whole corona situation, the disaster, even though Bolsonaro is encouraging the gathering stuff, the social distance, but all the governors, especially Doria, who's looking for a run, is promote himself through the corona. He's used the pandemic situation to promote himself for the 2022.
Okay. Brian, you know, on the political front, I want to ask you what you think is really set to happen now, given one, that Lula is now free. Many are, of course, expecting him to make a bid for the presidency in 2022. But many are also expecting, you know, politically motivated efforts to try to stop Lula from actually running. Should we be concerned that tackling the pandemic, Brian, might actually start taking a back seat to political maneuverings that could be to come with the election just over a year away?
I think the pandemic and the political maneuverings are interrelated. And this is clear in the example of João Doria, who ran on a campaign in which he called himself Bolsa Doria. He made T-shirts that had his and Bolsonaro's name on it. And he presented himself as this huge ally. And now he's using the pandemic to split from him, from his former ally. The fact of the matter is that Lula is now leading in all of the polls. And the question is, we know he was illegitimately removed from the election, from the last election, thrown in jail on frivolous charges that have now been dismissed by the Supreme Court. So the question is, will there really be free and fair elections next year? Bolsonaro might try to do something like Trump did. His own son, Eduardo, participated in the so-called War Council meeting in Washington, D.C. with Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell.
Right.
And so we don't know if there's going to be fair elections.
Okay. Julio, I know you disagree because I'm sure you're going to say that Lula was actually vindicated on a technicality, that the jurisdiction of that court, it was decided it was the wrong jurisdiction. Those suspicions and allegations are still out there against him. That's why I'm asking about that political maneuvering, taking the front seat in front of the coronavirus pandemic. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. The corruption fact is there. Justice Fachin just decided that Sérgio Moro didn't have jurisdiction to condemn Lula, but the corruption is there. There is no fact that at no point Fachin said like there's no corruption or lack of evidence. The corruption is there, just a lack of jurisdiction.
Okay, Marcio, your thoughts?
Definitely, I agree that corruption is there, but corruption aside, looking to the electoral efforts and the electoral power, Lula is very strong. He's leading the polls, and in a second round, he would beat Bolsonaro by 18 points. So if Lula runs, I think Lula might win.
Okay, a lot could happen in the year to come. We'll have to wait and see, and I'm sure I'll be talking to all of you again as that develops. But for now, Marcio, I'm going to have to give you the last word because we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us, and of course to our viewers for tuning in as well. See you next time.